Hi, my name is Jeff Grove from New Product Visions, and I want to welcome you to the webinar on a 5-step approach to reducing time to market. Before we get started, I want to give you a little bit of background on my company, New Product Visions. I help organizations improve business performance basically by getting better at innovation management. My focus is on the processes, the role of management, organization issues, as well as the culture. I provide consulting, the Innovation Coach workshops, and also some software enablers that I use with clients to support the processes. Prior to starting this company, I spent 30 plus years in industry in a variety of management roles in sales, marketing, service and support, manufacturing, and then just before starting my consulting company about 4 years ago, was VP of technology for about a $250 million analytical instrument business on the East Coast. When it comes to innovation management, I approach it as a practitioner. In the 30 plus years that I had in industry involved with new product development, that in combination with my consulting practice, those two things really I use with my clients in order to help them improve their success at innovation. That's very context specific. Each client is individual, and so it's not a one-size-fits-all type of solution for any specific client. I also approach it as a generalist in the sense that I've been involved in all aspects of the processes from the beginning to the point where products are brought out into market. Third, I look at it as a key business process, not simply the role of R&D. And finally, I'm particularly passionate about the role of senior management, since that's the type of background that I came out of. So today we're going to talk about time to market, and of course it matters for most every company. I've listed here what I think are some of the four of the more common reasons why time to market matters. First, certainly theoretically you can capture more of the ultimate sales by getting products to market faster. Second, we're always after a competitive advantage. We want to beat the competition to market. Third is, for many companies, being able to get products to market faster plays into this concept of market leadership. And then finally, a focus on time to market really is a good way to look at the overall NPD process, the new product development process, and improve it. So these are kind of some of the more four of the more common reasons. You might have particular reasons that are of interest to you when it comes to why time to market matters to your company. But when we think about time to market, I think in many cases we focus on the wrong things, the wrong levers, so to speak. And for many senior managers, that plays out in the sense that they want to motivate the teams to work harder and longer hours in order to get products to market faster. So there's this singular focus on the actual development speed, and in particular to try to get people to be motivated to work longer and harder. And while that is could be a short-term solution to getting products to market faster, it's not a long-term solution. If you've worked in an organization like that, it's just there are many unintended consequences long-term in terms of employee morale and turnover and so on and so forth. So that's not a long-term solution to the problem. Secondly, I think sometimes we tend to think about all projects being created equal, and they're not. This is a risk matrix for individual projects. On the x-axis is variation task, normal task variation, all the way up to unknown unknowns. And of course, as you go from here to there, the risk on the project goes up. And on the y-axis is system complexity, so from a low complexity system to a high complexity system. And again, as complexity goes from low to high, the risk on the project goes up. The bottom line, not every project that falls within this matrix should be speeded up. For instance, projects that are down in this area probably can be speeded up, and that might be the right thing to do. But projects that are up here with a lot of unknown unknowns, a lot of uncertainty, it's not always the best idea to speed those projects to market. And actually, there's some research that supports that comment. This actually was some data that was generated in 2012, and they looked at new product development speed and new product success. And they looked at three different factors: the degree of technological newness, technological turbulence, and market turbulence. And when those factors were high, you see this curvilinear response. In other words, at some point, actually speeding the project to market was detrimental in terms of the success. So the point is that not every product should be speeded up. And I've seen in my industrial experience projects that sometimes you just have to let things play out, and that might actually be best in terms of actual market success. So you need to focus on the right things. And third, time to market really matters little if you're not working on the right projects to begin with. So this is an example, the Amazon Fire Phone, that hundreds of millions of dollars were spent developing this product, but it was not successful when it hit the market. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're assuming that you have a robust process in place to choose the right projects. And certainly it's out of the context for this webinar. I'm happy to talk to you offline about issues associated with portfolio management and choosing the right projects. So we're going to assume that now you have that process in place, and the question becomes, how can you reduce time to market and get products to market faster? As I mentioned at the outset, I think we tend to focus on speeding up the development process itself. But I want to make a case to you today that there is a better way, and this 5-step approach, I think, is part of the solution. There are multiple things that you need to look at before you even get to the concept of speeding up the development process itself. This actually comes out of some work that was done several years ago, but I've taken it, incorporated it into my own thinking from my industrial experience, augmented it with my consulting experience, and what we're going to do is go through each of these 5 steps in turn, and I'll give you some tools and tips that, based on my experience, that you might want to think about. A couple things before I start that I'll mention is, first of all, as we go through these 5 steps, you're going to notice that many of them that we're going to talk about are actually not at the individual project level, but really at a higher system level. And you really need to think of the time to market not simply as a function of an individual project itself, but how you're running the entire development process. It's really a system effect. So that's one key point, and I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. The second thing I'm going to mention is that it really doesn't matter whether you're a manufacturing company or service company or software company. Many of the concepts that we're going to talk about here are universal in nature, so they can be applied to any situation. Some of the examples I use may be more appropriate for a manufacturing type company, but the concepts are going to be universal. So let's start first with simplification of the development process. And the first point I want to make has to do with how we define projects to begin with, and the natural tendency sometimes to create what might be termed a mega project, and whether that is really necessary. A mega project really is defined as, it actually comes about, I think, because our natural tendency in defining new products is to pack in everything that anybody has ever asked us for in that development. And so a mega project has very long duration, which means it has a very long planning horizon, makes it difficult to plan. At the same time, there are a lot of changes in the market, which means the project gets redirected, which means that you add more features, increases the scope, the schedule slips, which makes it longer. The scope is high or large with high investment, high risk, which means a lot more detailed planning, frequent program reviews, a lot of redirection, schedule slippage, adding features. It all kind of builds upon itself, but the project becomes like a black hole. It's very difficult to manage a project like this and get it out to market. And the question is it really necessary? In many cases, it probably isn't. But we don't stop sometimes to think about whether it's really necessary or not. And there is an alternative, and that is to bring a product out to the market in an incremental fashion. So incremental development can be used as a strategy to get products to market faster, and particularly using some type of a platform strategy. That's really the purpose of it. the idea is you come out with a product as quickly as possible, generation one, but you're already thinking about multiple generations and how to extend that product platform. You know, the challenge for many organizations is it takes a lot of work to do this. You have to, first of all, understand what really the customers want and be able to bring out that product as quickly as possible and spend the time to make sure that you know how you want that development to play out over time. The second point associated with simplification has to do with the number of projects in the portfolio and whether you can reduce the number of projects in the portfolio in order to simplify the whole development process and speed every project to market. You know, our natural tendency is to load our resources at 100%, but I think you pay a big penalty. And to have this discussion, I want to introduce you to this concept of the cumulative frontier, which I think is the shape of this curve is really pretty similar in every company that I've ever seen. The way this graph is generated is you've got all the projects here on the Y or the x-axis. You've got cumulative resources. In this case, we're going to assume that it's human resources, and on the y-axis, a cumulative measure of value. In this case, net present value. So for each project, you calculate what's called the NP index, which is the gain, which in this case is the cumulative, or the net present value for that particular project, divided by the cost and how much resources it's going to take to get that product to market. So you generate that NP index for every project, and then you plot the projects on this cumulative plot from high NP index to low NP index. And what you're going to find once you look at this data is invariably you're going to find some projects up here that add very little value to the overall value of the projects relative to the resources that it consumes. And the question becomes, do you really need to do that project? There might be good reasons why you have to do that project, but you want to make purposeful decisions about that. And the reality is that most organizations will find that a very high percentage of the value of the projects that they're working on can be accomplished with a fraction of the resources. So there's this whole batch of resources that you could either reapply to higher value projects, or alternatively, you might want to think about using that as slack in the process. I mean, the bottom line is that there is no free lunch here. That I think if you load resources at 100%, you are going to pay a penalty. And to make that point, I think that in every organization, there is this shape of curve where if you look at the resource loading, as you approach 100% of loading on your resources, I believe you also have a 100% chance that every project in the portfolio is subject to delay. Now, the shape of this curve may be different, but I think there is some important resource loading point that becomes critical, that above that you run the risk that you're really starting to delay the entire portfolio, or there's a higher risk of that. So like I said, I think this is very context specific. It's going to look different in every company, but I believe that you run the risk when you load your resources at more than close to 100% or more, that every project in the portfolio is going to be delayed. And that's because of the interrelated nature of the projects. What happens in one project can affect the other project, particularly because of resources and the fact that typically resources are working across multiple different projects. After I came up with this way to describe this challenge that I've seen in my experience, I happened to see this article in Discover magazine recently, and it really speaks to the same point. Here they were looking at power grids, and on the x-axis is the number of elements or the complexity in the system, which could be related to the resources that we talked about in the previous slide. And on the y-axis, the risk that there could be a collapse in that system. And in the previous slide, the risk that projects would get delayed. And you see the same thing. There's this, what they claim, or what they identify as this point of criticality, where above this point, the system is more subject, the risk goes up that there's going to be a collapse in that system. So I think any complex system will behave like this, and you have to think of your development system as a complex system because of the interrelated nature of the resources. When it comes to overloading the resources, I think another common problem is customer requests. So apart from the projects that you've got going on, there are customer requests that come into the same resources. And the fact is, every organization needs some type of a sub-process set up in order to decide what you're going to work on and what you're not going to work on. The fact is, you have to learn to say no. That goes against the grain. Many of us really, especially in smaller to mid-sized companies, we think of ourselves as very close to our customers. But the fact is, if every request that a customer makes is worked on, then you're really reacting, and you can't look at your development resources from a strategic standpoint. So you have to have some kind of system in place in order to decide what you can work on and what you can't work on. Okay, some other tips to simplify is this concept of technology versus product development. Those are two different things. Sometimes we mix them up. The bottom line is that if at all possible, if you can separate technology development from product development, you will be able to get that product to market faster when you actually start a project. This is challenging for many organizations from a couple different reasons. One is from a resource standpoint, whether you can actually resource technology development apart from product development, and secondly, it's a challenge from the standpoint of thinking through what you're actually going to need from a product development standpoint. So it takes a little bit more work to think through longer term what you're going to need from a technology standpoint and be able to develop those technologies before you start a project. But it will help you get projects to market faster if you can have those pieces in place. Reducing the number of vendors. In a manufacturing company, that's especially important, and simplifies the entire process when you don't have to deal with as many vendors and different systems that you have to deal with vendors and so on and so forth. And even things like simplifying documentation. In my industrial experience, sometimes we went overboard in terms of our documentation, particularly in terms of CAD documentation. We might have very, very complicated multi-page assembly drawings that never get used. You might be better off with a single document, single page exploded view, and then use Word documents and pictures to develop manufacturing procedures. So this plays out in many different examples and many different types of companies in terms of really, do you need that much internal documentation? Can you simplify the entire process by simplifying the documentation? Okay, after you've attacked simplification, then the next step is to eliminate steps. How can you eliminate things? And first of all, I want to talk about processes, our documented processes. This is in particular to our ISO NPD processes that we might have in place and how it relates to organization inertia. You know from your experience that inertia happens within organizations. We get these documented processes in place and then we have to follow them. And I think that you have to be careful about putting too many steps into the documented processes and forcing every project team to go through every step in every case. It might not be necessary. So you really need to think about your processes and give a lot of latitude to the project teams, in my view, and simplify in order to eliminate steps by how you develop those processes. Secondly, system architecture can be very important in terms of eliminating steps. Smart system architecture really needs to be elevated as a strategic decision within a development. Sometimes it's pushed down at a lower level in the organization or lower level engineers and so forth. It really needs to be elevated. It's really more of a strategic decision. And by smart architecture, you might be able to peel off an entire subsystem and buy an OEM module, for instance. Sometimes the decision on that really comes down to, is it really a key subsystem in terms of value to the customer? And if it's not, it might be something that you can purchase on the outside. So really, many of these decisions come down to trading time for money, in essence. So system architecture is one area where you can potentially eliminate steps. Of course, we talked about reliance on vendors and collaborators, but it applies to many other situations as well, and many other different types of companies. Anything that you can do to use outside resources and trade time for money, you at least need to consider it for each individual project as a way to eliminate steps. Reducing part count, this is especially important in manufacturing companies in order to eliminate steps. Customer testing, if you can do things with customers and eliminate the need for doing that internally, that's another way to accomplish that. Okay, so once you've simplified and find ways to eliminate steps, now you need to consider how can you do things in parallel. And we come back to system architecture, and I'll make a second point that really needs to be elevated in terms of strategic importance. And it also applies to being able to do things in parallel. Smart system architecture allows people and development to proceed in a parallel fashion. By defining these subsystems and the interfaces, you can, a smart project manager can really leverage doing many different tasks in parallel. In addition, another aspect of this has to do with our documented processes. In so many cases, we think of our phase gate process as a linear process where you proceed from one phase to another, and you have to go through gates in order to go from one phase to another. But the reality is much different. You really have to approach it as a mindset to be doing things in parallel, concurrently. And I think there's a real movement now in the phase development processes to think of them in this way, not as a linear process, but really as a series of concurrent phases that you have to do in parallel. So that's a very important mindset to have within your organization. Some other things from a parallel processing standpoint, I mentioned it, but your project management skills are very important. A skilled project manager will know how to do things in parallel. And so you really need to think about project management skills very strategically and find ways to increase the skill set within the project managers. Customer involvement, again, you can use customers to do things in parallel with your own internal efforts. And then third, I've found this in my personal experience, that sometimes we don't build enough prototypes. This is particularly true in manufacturing type settings. And in our rush to try to reduce project costs, we tend to skimp on the number of prototypes, which can really cost you in the end. So, listening to the project teams, building sufficient number of prototypes will allow you to do many things in parallel. Okay, so the fourth step is to eliminate delays in the process. And by far, I think the most important aspect of this is the actual decision-making processes are very important within the organization in terms of eliminating delays. And this is particularly important in terms of senior management. I've seen this play out time and time again where project teams, especially early in the project, have some very important strategic decisions to make, and senior management is quote-unquote too busy to make a decision, mostly because they're typically focused on the quarterly numbers. And the project might be 2 years out, and they just don't think that it's important for them to spend their time right now on that. That's a critical mistake in a lot of organizations. So I spend a lot of time in my consulting business with senior management to make sure they understand that the engagement is very important, and being able to quickly make decisions also has to do with the processes themselves and making sure that there's a robust process that institutionalizes good decision making within the organization. So a very important point that really is at the system level, again, not at the individual project level, but it can play out in every project in the portfolio. Another area in terms of eliminating these delays is team structure, and particularly in terms of how it supports communication, not only within the team, but within the organization itself. So team structure is very important and can help alleviate some of these delays in the decision making. There's a lot of choices in project team structure. Apart from organizational structure, you have decisions that you have to make, and it's very context specific based on the project. It goes from autonomous teams where the project leader has full control of the resources, which is actually the best structure for very high novelty projects or new to the market type products or new business models, innovative business models, through to heavyweight and lightweight team structures, which is probably more common in most matrix type organizations, down to functional type of teams. So, if you have a project and you've set it up as a functional team structure, but it really should be autonomous, you're going to pay a lot of penalties in terms of communication and delays in the process. So again, team structure is very important to consider in the context of eliminating delays. Another area is to think of, in manufacturing, we focus on flow through the process flow. Well, you can think of the same thing in a development process. So rather than a process here, you can replace that with a project. So you've got multiple projects going on, and invariably you're going to find that there are some functional bottlenecks in the process. Maybe this is a key resource. It just seems like every project has to go through this person to do a certain key task that impacts every project. Or maybe it's a key piece of equipment. So really looking at this as a system issue and attacking those bottlenecks can actually help all the projects in the portfolio in terms of eliminating delays. So once you've done these steps, simplify, eliminate steps, find where you can process things in parallel, and then eliminate delays, now you can get to actually speeding up the development process itself. And the first thing I want to talk about is actually related to product definition on an individual product and the concept of the need to go slow to go fast. And what this really relates to is the fact that so often we want to jump into development before we really fully define the product. Seems simple enough, but it's amazing how many problems I still see with companies. So it really behooves you to spend time up front to make sure there's no misunderstanding about what this product needs to be. And this is a kind of a tongue-in-cheek way to make that point, but the customer might have this vision, but every other functional group within the business might have different visions of what that product really needs to be. You have very many stakeholders that have to be brought into play, depending on the industry and technology and so forth. So you really need to spend time up front and go slow up front in order to go fast at the back end. Good product definition will also help you prevent or alleviate anyway the problem of scope creep and changing this project scope as the project unfolds. So all this plays into the concept of speeding up development. Another area in terms of speeding up development is the project manager. I mentioned this before, but a skilled project manager will really know what levers to pull in order to speed up an individual project. And it's going to be very context specific and is based on that tacit knowledge that builds up within your project management. So you really need to focus on focusing on building up those project management skills within your organization. A project manager that's very good at an incremental project, if suddenly they are tasked with a new to the world type of development, it will slow the project down. So developing those project management skills and using those to speed up the project is very important. Related to that, and I'll come back to this risk framework, is choosing the right project management tool based on the risk in the project. The fact is, if you're down in this area where you've got normal task variation and it's a relatively low complexity development, then the typical project tools like Gantt charts and Microsoft Project and using project buffers and those types of tools are very adequate and appropriate. But if you're out here where you're faced with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknown unknowns, and it may be a very complex development, doing a Gantt chart is really a waste of time. You really should focus on what you don't know and how you're going to learn it as quickly as possible. So really the lean methodologies, lean product development methodologies are really ideal out here. In fact, one of the software enablers that I'll mention at the end of the presentation is a company that provides a really nice platform for lean product development. And that really focuses on what you don't know and how you're going to learn it as quickly as possible rather than worrying about a Gantt chart, which as soon as you develop a Gantt chart for a project like this, it's out of date the next day. So it's just a waste of time. So understanding where you are and choosing the right project management tools will help you get the product to market as quickly as possible. If you're down here in this area, then a really nice tool is a concept called critical chain. It's a little different in terms of how you build a schedule. Again, this assumes that you know what the tasks are. A typical way that you build a schedule is you ask everybody doing a task to give you an estimate. And then you build the schedule, you look at the critical path and manage accordingly. But the fact is that when you ask somebody for a task estimate, they may say, well, it's going to take me 4 weeks, or I'm sorry, it's going to take me 2 weeks, but I know I'm going to get interrupted. I know that I've got other things I've got to do. I know I've got a couple of days of vacation coming up, so I'm going to give the project manager a 4-week estimate. And so every task in the schedule has some safety built into it. And invariably what that means is the person doesn't start the task right on time because they know they've built in some safety. They wait. They wait until the point that now, once they start the task, other problems come up, and then the task ends up taking longer. And then you compound that with every task, and it's easy for a schedule to slip in that scenario. So a different way to build a schedule is to use this concept that when you ask for a task estimate, you ask for it based on a 50% probability that you will make that task length. So 50% of the time, this task is going to go longer than this, and 50% of the time, it's going to go shorter. And that's how you build your schedule. And then you basically, based on the schedule and the critical path, you develop project buffers that protect the critical path. And there's a formula for how you calculate those buffers. But now the project manager basically just manages these buffers. And you don't penalize people when they are late. The only thing that really matters is when they start, because you know that half the time they're going to overextend their task time. So you make sure you have discipline to start the tasks on time. You manage for the buffers, and you actually have a chance in this scenario to pull the project in from a schedule standpoint. Here you have no hope of doing that, because really once you develop this schedule, it's going to go like this. You're not going to really have a chance to pull the schedule in. With this technique, you really do. So if you want to talk further about that, I'm happy to talk offline. Another concept for speeding up has to do with resources. Our typical phase gate process really kind of is built around the concept that you minimize investment to begin with. And then as you go through each phase, you increase investment, or in this case, the number of people. So you start out with a low number of project team members, and as the project unfolds, you add more. Invariably, what happens if the project gets in trouble, the natural tendency is for management to want to put more resources in the project at the end of the project. And if you've ever had experience managing projects, you know sometimes adding more resources at the back end actually slows it down. It doesn't speed it up. So an alternative, and there's some research that bears this out, is that you might consider front-loading the resources where the risk is higher. This kind of goes against the grain of the phase development processes, which emphasize minimizing risk, financial risk at the beginning. But the reality is that you can cut down, you can reduce uncertainty significantly, and then not have to add as many resources and actually speed up the development. So think about this when you are planning your resources. Okay, so hopefully I've given you some ideas, some tips that you can use to simplify, to eliminate steps, to do things in parallel, to find ways where you can eliminate delays and then speed up the development process. You might have other things that you can think of, but it's not good enough just to jump right to speeding up the development process. You really need to have a little bit higher level thinking. In my experience, the three most significant factors that I've found in time to market, one is this concept of overloading resources. I think that's the biggest challenge every organization has, and it affects the entire portfolio. It really requires a really robust resource management process, a resource allocation process, and that's outside the context of this webinar. I'm happy to talk to you offline. I have a lot of experience with this. I think it's a very important sub-process that that you need to focus on within your organization in order to understand where you are from a resource loading standpoint and how it affects the entire portfolio and how you can use it to leverage time to market. Scope creep and project definition. By spending time and doing project definition really well and resisting scope creep, I think that's the second big factor in time to market. And finally, this concept of technology versus product development and not mixing those two up. And if you do, understanding what it means from a time to market standpoint. As I mentioned at the outset and really implied in this discussion is that many of these things are really not at the individual project level, but really are at the system level. So if there's one key takeaway that if you haven't gotten anything else from this presentation, hopefully you'll take away the fact that when you think about time to market, you really need to address it at the system level first. And actually, I think you have a lot more leverage at the system level than you do at the individual project level. You know, the new product development system is a very complex system. It involves every functional group in the organization. Every project is different. It's unlike any other process within the organization. And you really need to think of time to market really in the context of the overall process, not at the individual project level. Okay, to finish up here, as I mentioned, my company, New Product Visions, provides consulting. I provide the Innovation Coach workshops as well as some software enablers. The Innovation Coach workshops are 2-day workshops, jam full of lots of content, exercises and case studies and so forth. I usually present these regionally. You can go to my website for the current schedule. They can also be customized and presented on site. There are short-term benefits in terms of projects running smoother and better coordination, better use of resources, better quality decision-making and faster decision-making. And there are long-term benefits in terms of stronger culture that supports innovation, better long-term planning, more successful products long-term, and top-line and bottom-line growth. That's really what it's all about. Software enablers, NPD Risk Assessor is a quantitative risk assessment tool. It's based on an empirical model. I use this with individual projects and at a portfolio level, but at a project level, it really is a great tool for a project team to look at their project. What are the factors that are based on this empirical model that are pushing that project further to failure or closer to success, and what can you do about it? So it's a really great tool, and it's also a great team building tool as well. Entroids is a lean product development project management tool. I mentioned that in the risk slide, the risk matrix slide. It's a really nice tool for doing lean product development management. And Greenlight Guru is a specific project management tool that's specialized for medical device manufacturers, those who have to meet FDA regulatory type of requirements. Okay, so here's my contact information, website, my email address. Through my website, you can access my blog, which I publish articles regularly on all kinds of topics related to innovation management. YouTube and Twitter, and I encourage you to reach out on LinkedIn if we're not already connected. And I also have a monthly column in South Carolina Manufacturer where I publish articles on various topics associated with innovation. Okay, with that, I will end the webinar. I appreciate your time, and if I can help you in any way, please contact me. Have a great day.